I thought I knew everything about my grandfather. Turns out I didn't know him at all. What I found in his basement 3 days after we buried him changed everything I believed about our family, about money, and about the quiet old man who raised me. They say you never really know someone until they're gone. But what happens when you discover the person you thought you knew never existed at all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain hadn't stopped since we lowered Grandpa William into the ground. It drummed against the windows of his old Victorian house on Maple Street, the same house where I'd spent every summer since I was 7 years old. Now, at 26, I stood in his kitchen for what I thought would be the last time, sorting through decades of accumulated memories. My name is Jessica Martinez, though Grandpa always called me Jessie-girl. I was the only one left to handle his affairs. Mom had passed 5 years earlier, and my father? Well, he'd been out of the picture since I was 3. Grandpa William Rodriguez had been my anchor, my constant, my everything. The funeral had been small, just like he would have wanted. A handful of neighbors, Mrs. Patterson from next door, old Mr. Chen who ran the corner market, and me. That was it. No extended family came forward. No long-lost relatives appeared, with stories I'd never heard. Just me and a few people who remembered him as the quiet man who kept to himself, but always had a kind word. What struck me most wasn't who was there, but who wasn't. For a man who had lived 83 years, the turnout felt impossibly small. It made me wonder if I really knew him at all, or if I'd only known the version of him he'd chosen to show me. I'd taken a week off from my job at Henderson Marketing Agency to get his affairs in order. The lawyer, Mr. Thompson, had been straightforward about the will. Everything went to me. The house, his savings account with about $12,000, and whatever personal belongings I wanted to keep. It wasn't much, but it was more than I'd expected from a man who'd worked construction his whole life and lived so modestly. But as I wandered through the rooms that Tuesday afternoon, something felt off. The house was too clean, too organized for someone who'd supposedly just been getting by on Social Security. The furniture was old but well-maintained. The appliances, while not new, were all in perfect working condition. Even his clothes were neatly pressed and organized by color and season. This wasn't the home of someone struggling financially. This was the home of someone who was careful, deliberate, and possibly hiding something. I started in his bedroom, going through dresser drawers filled with perfectly folded clothes. Everything smelled like his cologne, mixed with that old house scent I'd grown up loving. In his nightstand, I found reading glasses, a few books about woodworking, and a small leather journal filled with what looked like grocery lists and appointment reminders. Normal grandfather stuff. The living room yielded photo albums I'd seen 100 times. His collection of Western movies on DVD, and a stack of Popular Mechanics magazines dating back to the 1990s. Still nothing unusual. It was when I reached his study that things got interesting. Grandpa had always called it his thinking room, and growing up, I'd been allowed in only when he specifically invited me. It contained an old wooden desk, a comfortable reading chair, and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with technical manuals, business books, and what appeared to be accounting ledgers. Accounting ledgers. I'd never known Grandpa to be particularly interested in numbers beyond basic household budgeting. I pulled one of the ledgers from the shelf, expecting to find records of household expenses or maybe some old tax information. Instead, I found meticulous records of income and expenses for something called Rodriguez Solutions, LLC. The entries went back 15 years, showing monthly revenues that started small but grew steadily over time. My hands were shaking as I flipped through page after page of detailed financial records. This wasn't household bookkeeping. This was business accounting, and it was substantial. The most recent entries showed monthly revenues in the tens of thousands of dollars. Tens of thousands. Per month. I grabbed another ledger, then another. The picture that emerged made no sense. According to these records, my grandfather had been running a successful business for over a decade, generating more income in a single month than I made in half a year at my marketing job. But what business? I'd never seen him do anything but putter around the house, work in his garden, and occasionally disappear for a few hours in the afternoons, saying he was running errands, or meeting some fellows about a project. My chest felt tight as I realized how little I actually knew about the man who'd raised me. These ledgers represented a secret life, a hidden identity that he'd kept from everyone, including me. I heard the back door creak and froze. Nobody else had keys to this house. My heart pounded as footsteps echoed through the kitchen. "Jessica, you in here?" The voice was familiar but unexpected. It was Tom Harrison, a man I vaguely remembered from the neighborhood. He was probably in his 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes. I'd seen him talking to Grandpa over the fence a few times but had never really paid attention. "Mr. Harrison?" I called out, closing the ledger and walking toward the kitchen. "What are you doing here?" He stood in the doorway, holding a set of keys and looking genuinely surprised to see me. "I'm sorry, Jessica. I didn't know you were here. I came by to check on some equipment downstairs. Your grandfather gave me a key years ago for business purposes." Business purposes. The words hit me like cold water. "What equipment?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Tom's expression shifted. He looked uncomfortable, like he'd accidentally revealed something he shouldn't have. "You don't know about the workshop, do you?" "What workshop?" He sighed and ran a hand through his silver hair. "Jessica, your grandfather didn't just live in this house. He worked here. We all did. Has anyone shown you the basement?" I shook my head. Growing up, the basement had been off limits. Grandpa always said it was just storage and that the stairs were too dangerous for a kid. As I got older, I simply never thought to question it. It was just another part of the house I didn't need to see. "I think you need to come downstairs with me," Tom said gently. "There are some things about your grandfather that you should know." We walked to the basement door together. Tom pulled out his keychain and selected a key I'd never seen before. The door, which I'd always assumed was just locked for safety reasons, opened with a soft click. The stairs were solid oak, not the rickety wooden steps I'd imagined. As we descended, motion sensor lights flickered on automatically, illuminating what I can only describe as the most sophisticated workshop I'd ever seen. The basement had been completely renovated. The concrete walls were painted white and lined with professional-grade tool storage systems. Workbenches ran along 2 walls, equipped with precision instruments, computer monitors, and equipment I couldn't even identify. In the center of the room sat 3 large machines that looked like a cross between 3D printers and manufacturing equipment. But what stopped me in my tracks were the products. Dozens of small electronic devices were arranged on shelves, each labeled with model numbers and specifications. They looked like high-tech gadgets, sleek and professional, nothing like the simple woodworking projects I'd expected from my grandfather. "What is all this?" I whispered. Tom walked over to one of the workbenches and picked up one of the devices. "Your grandfather was an inventor, Jessica. These are mobility assistance devices for seniors and people with disabilities. Smart canes that can detect obstacles, medication reminder systems, emergency alert devices that actually work reliably. He's been developing and manufacturing them down here for 15 years. I felt dizzy. This couldn't be real. My grandfather, the man who still used a flip phone and complained about how complicated the TV remote was, had been running a high-tech manufacturing operation in his basement. But how? He barely understood email. He asked me to program his coffee maker. Tom smiled sadly. "That was his cover, Jessica. Your grandfather was one of the smartest men I ever knew. But he was also one of the most private. He didn't want anyone to know what he was really doing down here, including you." "Why not me? I was his granddaughter. I lived here every summer." "Because he was protecting you. And because what he was building was bigger than just a business. It was a mission." Tom walked over to a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all handwritten and addressed to Rodriguez Solutions. "Read a few of these," he said, handing me the folder. I opened the first letter. It was from a woman named Dorothy Klein in Phoenix, Arizona. "Dear Mr. Rodriguez, I can't thank you enough for the walking cane you sent my husband. The fall detection feature saved his life last month when he collapsed in our garage. The ambulance arrived within minutes because of your device. You refused to let us pay the full price, insisting that, quote, everyone deserves to age with dignity. You are a blessing." The second letter was from a family in Detroit. "Mr. Rodriguez, Our grandmother has been using your medication reminder system for 8 months now. For the first time in years, she hasn't missed a single dose. More importantly, she feels independent again. When we tried to pay your invoice, you sent the money back with a note saying, "Helping seniors is payment enough. We don't know how to thank you." Letter after letter, all telling similar stories. People whose lives had been changed by devices my grandfather had created, often for free or at costs so low they barely covered materials. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely audible. "If he was helping all these people, if the business was successful, why did he live so simply? Why did he pretend to be just scraping by?" Tom sat down on a stool next to one of the workbenches. "Because your grandfather wasn't interested in getting rich, Jessica. He was interested in solving problems. Every dollar that came in went right back into research, materials, or helping people who couldn't afford to pay. He lived simply because he chose to, not because he had to." I looked around the workshop again, seeing it with completely different eyes. This wasn't just a basement full of gadgets. It was a laboratory, a factory, and a mission center, all rolled into one. My grandfather had been running a secret operation to help seniors live independently, and he'd been doing it for 15 years without ever saying a word to anyone. "How many people knew about this?" I asked. "Just a few of us. I helped with some of the electrical work. Mrs. Chen handled shipping and receiving packages. Mr. Patterson helped with deliveries sometimes. We all believed in what William was doing, so we kept his secret." That explained why Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Chen had been at the funeral. They weren't just neighbors who remembered a kind old man. They were colleagues who had lost a business partner and friend. "But why the secret? Why not tell me? Why not tell everyone?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. "Because your grandfather knew that once people found out what he was really doing, everything would change. People would want to invest, to scale up, to turn it into a real business. Others would try to stop him because he was giving too much away for free. He wanted to keep it pure, to keep it about helping people instead of making money." I walked over to one of the workbenches and picked up what looked like a sophisticated smartphone. When I pressed the power button, the screen came to life with large, clear icons and simple navigation. "That's his latest project," Tom explained. "A smartphone designed specifically for seniors, simplified interface, emergency features, but with all the capabilities of a regular phone. He was planning to launch it next month." Next month. My grandfather had been working on new projects right up until he died. He'd had plans, goals, people depending on him, and I'd known nothing about any of it. I sat down heavily in his desk chair, the same chair where he'd apparently spent countless hours designing products that changed people's lives. On the desk was a half-finished sketch of some kind of mobility device, with notes written in his careful handwriting about weight distribution and battery life. "Tom," I said slowly, "what happens to all of this now, to the business, to the people who were depending on his products?" He looked around the workshop with sadness in his eyes. "I honestly don't know, Jessica. William never talked about succession planning. I think he hoped he'd have more time to figure it out." I thought about the ledgers upstairs, about the letters from grateful customers, about the sophisticated equipment surrounding me. My grandfather had built something remarkable, something that mattered to hundreds of people, and now it was all sitting in a basement with no one to run it. "Tell me everything," I said, looking directly at Tom. "I want to know exactly what my grandfather was doing down here, how it worked, and who else was involved. If he built something this important, then maybe it doesn't have to die with him." Tom smiled for the first time since I'd met him in the kitchen. "I think William would have liked hearing that. Are you sure you're ready for this story? Because once you know the truth about your grandfather, there's no going back to thinking of him as just a simple old man." I looked around the workshop one more time, at the machines humming quietly, at the shelves of devices waiting to help people, at the half-finished projects that represented solutions to problems I'd never even considered. "I'm ready," I said. "Tell me who my grandfather really was." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tom pulled up a chair next to me, and for the next 2 hours he unraveled a story that completely shattered everything I thought I knew about my grandfather's life. "It started about 16 years ago," Tom began, adjusting his glasses as he looked around the workshop. Your grandfather came to me with a problem. His neighbor, Mrs. Ellis, you probably don't remember her. She passed about 10 years back, had fallen and broken her hip. She was terrified of falling again, but the medical alert devices on the market were either too expensive, too complicated, or just didn't work reliably. He walked over to a display case I hadn't noticed before, filled with what looked like the evolution of a single product. William spent 3 months in this basement, teaching himself electronics, programming, everything from scratch. He was determined to build something better. I picked up the first device in the case. It was crude compared to the sleek products I'd seen on the shelves, clearly a prototype made from salvaged parts and held together with electrical tape. That was version 1, Tom smiled. Ugly as sin, but it worked. When Mrs. Ellis tested it, the thing detected her fall and called for help faster than any commercial device available. Word got around the senior center, and suddenly William had 5 more people asking if he could make them one too. But how did he learn all this? Grandpa was a construction worker. That's what everyone thought. But Jessica, your grandfather had been reading technical manuals and electronics journals for decades. He just never told anyone. After he retired, he finally had time to put all that theoretical knowledge to practical use. Tom led me to another section of the basement I hadn't fully explored. Behind a partition was what looked like a complete electronics laboratory, with testing equipment, soldering stations, and components organized in precise rows. By year 2, he was getting requests from all over Arizona. By year 3, people were calling from other states. Your grandfather realized he had stumbled onto something much bigger than helping a few neighbors. He pulled out a large binder filled with correspondence and order forms. This is when I got involved. William needed help with the electrical systems, and my background is in industrial engineering. When he showed me what he was building and why, I couldn't say no. I flipped through the binder, amazed by the volume of requests. Letters from families, doctors, nursing homes, all seeking solutions to problems I'd never considered. But what struck me most was my grandfather's response to each one. Instead of standard business replies, he'd written personal notes, asking detailed questions about specific needs and situations. He treated every customer like family, Tom continued. If someone couldn't afford the full price, he'd find a way to make it work. If a device needed customization for a specific disability, he'd spend weeks perfecting it. This wasn't just business to him, Jessica. It was a calling. But the money, I said, thinking about those ledgers upstairs. The business was generating serious revenue. Tom nodded. It was. But here's what made your grandfather different. Every penny got reinvested. New equipment, better materials, research and development. And then there were the pro bono cases. He led me to a filing cabinet marked Special Projects. Inside were folders containing cases that made my heart ache. A veteran who'd lost both legs and couldn't afford mobility assistance. A young mother with early-onset Parkinson's who needed help maintaining independence for her children. An elderly man whose Social Security barely covered rent, let alone medical devices. William helped all of them for free, Tom said quietly. Not just discounted prices. Completely free. He'd say, Tom, that man served his country. The least I can do is help him walk to his mailbox with dignity. I sat down hard, overwhelmed by the scope of what I was learning. This wasn't just a side business my grandfather had hidden from me. This was a massive operation, touching hundreds of lives, run by a man I was beginning to realize I'd never truly known. How many people were involved in keeping this secret? More than you might think. Fewer than it seemed. Mrs. Chen at the corner market was actually our shipping coordinator. All those errands your grandfather ran? He was picking up packages and materials. Mr. Patterson helped with local deliveries. Sarah Williams from the library helped him with internet research and online orders. Sarah Williams. I remembered her from the funeral, a quiet woman in her 50s who'd spoken briefly about Grandpa's kindness to everyone he met. Another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. There were a few others, Tom continued. Dr. Martinez at the medical center, your grandfather's doctor, ironically, provided medical insights for device development. Janet Rodriguez from the senior center helped identify needs and test products. Even Father Murphy at St. Catherine's was involved, connecting William with families who needed help. I realized that what I'd interpreted as a small, sad funeral had actually been a gathering of business partners and collaborators, all maintaining the secret even in death. But why keep it from me specifically? The question that had been burning in my chest finally came out. I was family. I was here every summer, spending weeks in this house. How did I never see any of this? Tom's expression grew gentle but serious. Because your grandfather was protecting you, Jessica. And because he was protecting the mission. He walked over to the desk and picked up a framed photograph I hadn't noticed before. It showed my grandfather with a group of about 20 people, all holding various devices. They were smiling, and my grandfather stood in the center with an expression of pure joy I'd rarely seen on his face. This was taken at the senior center 3 years ago, Tom explained, a celebration for people whose lives had been changed by William's inventions. He was so proud that day, but when I suggested he should tell you about it, he refused. Why? Because he knew you, Jessica. He knew you had a big heart and strong opinions about fairness and justice. If you'd found out he was helping all these people, you would have wanted to help too. You would have dropped everything to join the mission. I stared at him, and that would have been bad because you were 23 years old with your whole life ahead of you. You had just started your career, you were building your own identity. William didn't want you sacrificing your future for his crusade, no matter how worthy it was. The truth of that hit me harder than I expected. Tom was right. If I'd known about this operation, I would have quit my job immediately and devoted myself to helping. I would have seen it as my purpose, my inheritance, my responsibility. He wanted you to become who you were meant to be, Tom continued, not who you thought you should be because of his choices. He used to say, Jessie-girl is going to change the world in her own way. I don't want her feeling obligated to change it in mine. I felt tears welling up, but they weren't just from sadness. They were from a growing sense of awe at the depth of my grandfather's love and wisdom. He'd built this incredible operation while simultaneously protecting me from feeling burdened by it. There's something else, Tom said, walking to a locked cabinet I hadn't noticed before. He produced another key and opened it, revealing a collection of awards and certificates I'd never seen. Innovation Award from the Arizona Technology Council, he read from the certificates. Recognition from the National Institute on Aging. Humanitarian Technology Award from the AARP. Your grandfather was invited to conferences, asked to speak at universities, offered partnerships with major corporations. He turned them all down? Every single one. He said the moment Rodriguez Solutions became public, it would stop being about helping people and start being about profit margins and investor returns. He'd seen too many good ideas get corrupted by success. I thought about my job at the marketing agency, about the constant pressure to maximize revenue and minimize costs, about how every decision ultimately came down to what would generate the most profit. My grandfather had built something that operated on completely different principles. Show me how it all worked, I said. The day-to-day operations, the production process, everything. For the next hour, Tom walked me through the intricate system my grandfather had created. Orders came in through a simple website that looked like it had been designed in 1995. Sarah Williams managed the inquiries, screening for genuine need versus commercial resellers. Each device was custom-built in this basement workshop. My grandfather would spend hours on each unit, testing every component, calibrating sensors, ensuring perfect functionality. The production capacity was intentionally limited, maybe 20 devices per month, because quality was more important than quantity. The waiting list was 6 months long, Tom explained. People were willing to wait because they knew what they'd receive would be exactly what they needed, built specifically for their situation. He showed me the testing protocols, pages of documentation detailing how each device was evaluated for durability, accuracy, and ease of use. My grandfather had created quality standards that exceeded anything in the commercial market. But what about competition? Other companies making similar products? Tom laughed. That was the genius of Williams' approach. He wasn't trying to compete with anyone. The big companies focused on mass-market products with maximum profit margins. Your grandfather focused on edge cases, specific needs, people the big companies ignored. because there wasn't enough money in helping them. He pulled out a map of the United States covered in colored pins. Each pin represents a customer. Red for mobility assistance, blue for medical alert devices, green for cognitive support systems. Look at the distribution. The pins were scattered everywhere, but clustered in rural areas and smaller cities, places where major medical device companies didn't bother to establish strong support networks. Your grandfather found the gaps in the system and filled them, Tom said. He wasn't trying to get rich or build a corporate empire. He was trying to solve problems that nobody else cared about solving. As we talked, I began to understand the true scope of what had been happening in this house. This wasn't just a hobby that got out of hand, or a small business that grew organically. This was a carefully planned and executed mission to help people who had been forgotten by the mainstream market. Tom, I said finally, what happens now? To all of this? To the people depending on these products? To the waiting list? He was quiet for a long moment, looking around the workshop with obvious sadness. I honestly don't know, Jessica. Your grandfather was the heart of this operation. Without him, I'm not sure any of us know how to keep it going. I thought about the letters upstairs, about the grateful customers who had found dignity and independence through my grandfather's work. I thought about the waiting list, about people who were counting on devices that might never be built now. What if we tried? I asked quietly. Tom looked at me with surprise. What do you mean? What if we tried to keep it going? You know the technical side. Mrs. Chen knows the shipping. Sarah knows the customer service. Maybe together we could figure out how to honor what Grandpa built. Jessica, Tom said gently, this isn't something you can just step into. It took your grandfather years to develop the expertise, the relationships, the systems. And it consumed his entire life. You have your own career, your own goals. I looked around the workshop again, at the half-finished projects, at the tools waiting for hands that would never pick them up again. But I also saw something else, an opportunity to continue something meaningful, something that mattered more than quarterly reports and marketing campaigns. Maybe, I said, but maybe that's exactly what I need right now. Maybe I've been so focused on building someone else's dream that I forgot to consider building something of my own. Tom studied my face carefully. Are you sure about this, Jessica? Because if you're serious, there are things you need to know, things about the challenges your grandfather faced, about why keeping this secret was so important, and about what it really takes to help people the way he did. I felt a flutter of nervousness, but also something I hadn't felt in years. Genuine excitement about a future I could create, rather than one that had been planned for me. Tell me everything, I said. If I'm going to do this, I want to understand exactly what I'm getting into. Tom reached into another filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder labeled Challenges and Setbacks. Just holding it made my stomach tighten. Your grandfather didn't just build a successful operation, Jessica. He survived attempts to shut it down, dealt with threats, and faced obstacles that would have destroyed most people's dreams. He opened the folder, revealing a collection of legal documents, cease and desist letters, and official government correspondence that made my blood run cold. This started about 8 years ago, Tom said, pulling out a letter on expensive law firm letterhead. Medicor Industries, one of the largest medical device manufacturers in the country, sent this to your grandfather. I read the letter, my hands shaking. It was a legal threat, claiming that Rodriguez Solutions was infringing on patents, operating without proper FDA approvals, and engaging in unfair competition. They demanded he cease all operations immediately or face federal prosecution. But his devices were different, right? Original designs? Completely original. Your grandfather was meticulous about patent research. But that wasn't the real issue. Tom pulled out more documents. Medicor wasn't concerned about patent infringement. They were concerned about market disruption. He showed me internal emails that had somehow been leaked to my grandfather. Company executives discussing, quote, the Rodriguez problem, and how his low-cost, high-quality devices were making their overpriced products look bad. Here's what they didn't expect, Tom continued. Your grandfather wasn't some naive inventor they could intimidate. He'd spent months researching medical device regulations, consulting with lawyers, and ensuring every aspect of his operation was completely legal. The next document in the folder was my grandfather's response to Medicor's threats. It was 12 pages of meticulously documented evidence showing that every Rodriguez Solutions device met or exceeded FDA requirements for similar products, that all patents were either expired or didn't apply to his designs, and that his operation posed no legal threat to anyone. But the most powerful part was the final paragraph. Medicor Industries has built a business model based on keeping life-saving technology expensive and inaccessible to those who need it most. Rodriguez Solutions exists to serve the people your company has chosen to ignore. If you believe that helping seniors live independently is somehow illegal or immoral, I invite you to explain that position to the families who depend on our devices. He sent copies to the state attorney general, the FDA, and 3 major newspapers, Tom said with obvious pride. Medicor backed down within a week. But that wasn't the end of the challenges. The folder contained evidence of other obstacles. Suppliers who suddenly refused to sell components after receiving, quote, pressure from larger companies. Shipping companies that mysteriously lost packages. And even a break-in attempt at the house that Tom suspected wasn't random. Your grandfather never let any of it stop him, but it took a toll. He became more secretive, more protective of the operation. That's when he installed the advanced security system, upgraded the locks, and started limiting who knew about specific aspects of the business. I thought about all the summers I'd spent in this house, never realizing it was under siege from corporate interests who saw my grandfather's compassion as a threat to their profit margins. There's something else, Tom said, his voice growing more serious. The real reason your grandfather was so protective of this secret, especially from you. He pulled out a folder I hadn't seen before, labeled with my name. Inside were newspaper clippings, printed emails, and what looked like surveillance reports. Jessica, 3 years ago, Medicor tried a different approach. They researched your grandfather's family, looking for leverage they could use against him. My hands went cold as I saw my own photograph paper-clipped to a report about my job, my apartment, my daily routines. Someone had been watching me, documenting my life, and I'd never known. They approached your grandfather with an offer, Tom continued. Stop the operation, and they'd guarantee you a high-paying job at their company. Refuse. And they'd make sure you were blacklisted from the marketing industry. I felt sick. They threatened my career to get to him? It gets worse. When your grandfather refused their offer, they tried to follow through on the threat. That marketing campaign you worked on for Peterson Electronics 2 years ago? The one that got canceled at the last minute for quote 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 quote. I remembered. It had been my biggest project, months of work that vanished overnight. My boss had been apologetic but vague about the real reasons. Medicor was Peterson's largest client. They made it clear that continued business depended on dropping your agency's services. The room felt like it was spinning. My career setbacks, the projects that had mysteriously fallen through, the opportunities that had seemed promising until they suddenly weren't. How much of that had been corporate retaliation against my grandfather? He never told you because he didn't want you to carry that burden, Tom said gently. Every time they tried to use you against him, he found ways to protect both you and the mission. But it reinforced his belief that keeping you separate from the operation was the only way to keep you safe. I sat down heavily in my grandfather's chair, overwhelmed by the complexity of what he'd been managing. He hadn't just been running a business. He'd been fighting a war against people who wanted to destroy him, all while protecting me from becoming collateral damage. But there were victories too, Tom said, opening another section of the folder. Look at this. He showed me a letter from the Arizona State Senate, officially recognizing Rodriguez Solutions for outstanding service to the senior community. There were testimonials from doctors who had started recommending my grandfather's devices to their patients. A thank you letter from a VA hospital that had partnered with him to help disabled veterans. Your grandfather was winning, Jessica. Slowly, quietly, but definitely winning. The corporate pressure was actually validation that he was making a real difference. Tom walked over to a computer terminal I hadn't noticed before and powered it on. The screen filled with what looked like a customer database, but the information displayed wasn't typical business metrics. This is how your grandfather measured success, Tom explained, pointing to various fields on the screen. Not revenue or profit margins, but lives improved. Independence restored. Families reunited because someone could live safely in their own home, instead of being forced into institutional care. The database contained stories that brought tears to my eyes. An 89-year-old woman who had been able to attend her great-granddaughter's wedding because my grandfather's mobility device gave her confidence to leave the house. A veteran who had reconnected with his children after regaining independence through adaptive technology. A couple married for 60 years who could stay together in their own home instead of being separated by different care needs. Over 1,200 people, Tom said quietly. That's how many lives your grandfather directly impacted through this operation. And each one of them represents family members, caregivers, medical professionals who were also affected. I clicked through record after record of people whose worlds had been changed by devices built in this basement by a man who had hidden his compassion behind a facade of simplicity. Jessica, Tom said, sitting down across from me, I need you to understand what you'd be taking on if you really want to continue this work. It's not just about building devices or managing a business. You'd be inheriting enemies, ongoing threats, and responsibilities that could consume your entire life. I looked around the workshop, thinking about everything I'd learned. My grandfather had built something beautiful and important, but he'd also been fighting battles I'd never imagined. The question wasn't whether I was capable of continuing his work. It was whether I was prepared for the cost of doing so. Tell me about the financial reality, I said. How did he manage to fund all of this while living so modestly? Tom pulled out the most recent financial records. Your grandfather was extremely disciplined about money. Every device sold funded the next round of research and development. Every dollar of profit went to helping someone who couldn't afford to pay full price. He showed me spreadsheets that revealed the true scope of my grandfather's generosity. For every device sold at market price, he had given away 2 others at cost or for free. The business was sustainable, but only because he had kept his personal expenses minimal and reinvested everything. The house was paid off decades ago. He drove the same truck for 15 years. He grew his own vegetables and bought clothes at thrift stores. Not because he had to, but because every dollar he didn't spend on himself was a dollar he could spend on helping someone else. I thought about my own lifestyle, the apartment rent, the car payment, the restaurant meals, the shopping habits I'd never really questioned. My grandfather had made choices I'd never considered, prioritizing purpose over comfort in ways that seemed almost impossible in today's world. What about the legal structure, the business licenses, insurance, liability protection? All handled properly, Tom assured me. Your grandfather might have been secretive, but he wasn't careless. Rodriguez Solutions is a legitimate LLC with proper insurance, legal compliance, and even an accountant who handles tax filings. He introduced me to Margaret Chen, Mrs. Chen's daughter, it turned out, who had been handling the financial and legal aspects of the operation remotely. She was a CPA who had volunteered her services because she believed in the mission. The business is financially sound, Margaret explained via phone. Properly structured, fully compliant, and actually quite profitable if you consider profit as impact rather than just money. Your grandfather was a better businessman than most CEOs I work with. But she also warned me about the challenges ahead. The operation was built around William's personal relationships and reputation. Customers trusted him, suppliers worked with him, partners collaborated with him. Continuing without him means rebuilding all of those relationships from scratch. As the afternoon wore on, Tom introduced me to other aspects of the operation I hadn't yet discovered. A partnership with a local nursing school, where students got hands-on experience with adaptive technology. A collaboration with the engineering department at Arizona State University, where graduate students worked on research projects. A quiet network of healthcare professionals who recommended Rodriguez Solutions devices to patients who needed them. Your grandfather wasn't just running a business, Tom explained. He was building an ecosystem of people who believed that technology should serve humanity, not the other way around. But he also showed me the vulnerabilities in that system. Key relationships that depended on personal trust, informal agreements that weren't documented, processes that existed only in my grandfather's memory. The operation was more fragile than it appeared, held together by the force of one man's vision and personality. If you decide to take this on, Jessica, you won't just be continuing a business. You'll be stepping into a movement. And movements require leaders who are willing to sacrifice comfort for purpose. I spent the rest of the evening alone in the workshop, reading through customer files, studying device specifications, and trying to understand the full scope of what my grandfather had built. Each story I read reinforced the same truth. This work mattered in ways that my marketing career never had. But I also understood the weight of the decision I was facing. Taking on Rodriguez Solutions wouldn't just change my career, it would change my entire life. There would be no going back to the simple existence I'd been living, no retreat to the safety of working for someone else's dreams. As I sat in my grandfather's chair, surrounded by the evidence of his secret mission, I realized that he had given me more than an inheritance. He had given me a choice between the life I had been living and the life I could choose to live. The question was whether I had the courage to choose purpose over security, impact over income, and meaning over comfort. Tomorrow I would have to decide. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my grandfather's kitchen table with a legal pad, making lists, pros and cons, risks and opportunities, questions I needed answered before I could make a decision that would change everything. At 6 a.m., my phone rang. It was Tom. "Jessica, I'm sorry to call so early, but we have a situation. Mrs. Anderson in Tucson. She's been waiting 4 months for a custom mobility device your grandfather was building. She fell yesterday and broke her wrist. Her daughter called this morning, desperate. She needs that device now, or they're going to have to move her into assisted living." I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't theoretical anymore. There was a real person whose independence hung in the balance, depending on work my grandfather would never finish. "What would Grandpa have done?" I asked. "He would have driven to Tucson today with the device, even if it meant working all night to complete it." I looked toward the basement door, knowing that downstairs was an unfinished project that could change someone's life. "Is it possible to finish? The device, I mean?" "Technically, yes. Your grandfather left detailed notes, and the hardware is about 80% complete. But Jessica, this isn't just about assembly. These devices require calibration, testing, customization for the specific user. It's not something you can learn in a day." "Then teach me." There was silence on the other end of the phone. Finally, Tom said, "Are you sure about this? Because once you make that first delivery, you're committed. Mrs. Anderson will tell other people, and those people will call, and before you know it, you'll be responsible for dozens of lives." I thought about the woman in Tucson, probably sitting in pain, facing the loss of her independence because the one person who could help her was gone. I thought about all the other people on the waiting list, all the families hoping for solutions that might never come. "What time can you be here?" I asked. 2 hours later, Tom arrived with Mrs. Chen, Margaret, who had driven up from Phoenix, and Sarah Williams. Looking at them gathered in my grandfather's kitchen, I realized this was the core team that had helped him change so many lives. "Before we start," Sarah said gently, "we need to be honest with you about what you're getting into. Your grandfather made this look easy, but it wasn't. Every device requires research, customization, testing, and follow-up support. Are you prepared for that level of commitment?" I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was agreeing to. We spent the morning in the workshop, with Tom walking me through the Anderson project step by step. The device was a smart walker designed specifically for someone with arthritis and balance issues. It had sensors that could detect instability, automatic braking systems, and even a communication system that could call for help if needed. "Your grandfather spent 3 weeks just on the grip design," Tom explained, showing me sketches and prototypes. "Mrs. Anderson has severe arthritis in her hands, so the grips had to be exactly the right size, texture, and angle to minimize pain while maximizing control." The attention to detail was overwhelming. Every component had been selected not just for functionality, but for the specific needs of one person. This wasn't mass production. It was artisanal technology, crafted with the same care a master woodworker might put into a custom piece of furniture. Margaret showed me the business side of the operation. Each device has a complete file: medical history, physical limitations, living situation, family support structure. Your grandfather treated every customer like a patient, not just a buyer. Mrs. Anderson's file was inches thick. Physical therapy reports, occupational therapy assessments, detailed measurements, even photographs of her home layout to ensure the device would work in her specific environment. "This is incredible," I said, flipping through pages of information. "How did he gather all this?" "House calls," Sarah answered. "For complex cases, your grandfather would drive to meet customers in person. He'd spend hours evaluating their needs, measuring their space, understanding their daily routines. That's why his devices worked so well. They weren't just technically sound, they were perfectly matched to real-world situations." I felt a wave of doubt. This level of personalization, this depth of care, how could I possibly replicate what my grandfather had spent decades perfecting? But Mrs. Chen, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Jessica, your grandfather wasn't born knowing how to do this. He learned by caring more about getting it right than about being perfect immediately. The question isn't whether you can do it as well as he did. The question is whether you care enough to learn." The next 6 hours were the most intense learning experience of my life. Tom taught me basic electronics, showing me how to test circuits, calibrate sensors, and troubleshoot problems. Sarah walked me through customer service protocols, explaining how to gather information, document needs, and provide ongoing support. Margaret reviewed the financial systems, quality control procedures, and legal compliance requirements. But the most important lesson came from Mrs. Chen, who showed me how to think about each device from the user's perspective. "Your grandfather always said technology should adapt to people, not the other way around," she explained. "Every decision, from button placement to display brightness, should make the user's life easier, not more complicated." By late afternoon, we had completed Mrs. Anderson's walker. It looked deceptively simple, but I now understood the sophisticated engineering hidden beneath its user-friendly exterior. The real test, however, would be whether it actually worked for her. "Road trip," Tom announced. "We're driving to Tucson tonight." The 2.5-hour drive gave me time to process what I'd learned and prepare for what would essentially be my first customer interaction as the potential new face of Rodriguez Solutions. Mrs. Anderson lived in a modest ranch house in a retirement community. When we arrived, she was in a wheelchair, her right arm in a cast, looking frustrated and defeated. "You must be William's granddaughter," she said, studying my face. "You have his eyes. I was so sorry to hear about his passing. He was a remarkable man." I felt the weight of representing my grandfather's legacy as we wheeled the custom walker into her living room. Tom had coached me on the setup process during the drive, but actually calibrating the device for a real person felt completely different from practicing in the workshop. Mrs. Anderson's daughter, Patricia, watched nervously as I adjusted the height, tested the grip angle, and calibrated the stability sensors. Every measurement had to be perfect because this device would determine whether an 82-year-old woman could remain independent in her own home. "The walker learns your gait pattern," I explained, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "After a few days of use, it will automatically adjust to provide exactly the right amount of support for your specific needs." When Mrs. Anderson first stood up using the walker, my heart pounded. If anything went wrong, if the calibration was off, if the sensors failed, if I'd made any mistake in the assembly, the consequences could be disastrous. But she took her first step, then another. The walker moved smoothly, providing support exactly when she needed it. Her face lit up with a smile I'll never forget. "I feel steady," she said, almost in wonder. "For the first time in months, I feel truly steady." We spent an hour training Mrs. Anderson and Patricia on the walker's features, troubleshooting potential issues, and providing contact information for ongoing support. As we prepared to leave, Mrs. Anderson took my hand. "Your grandfather saved my independence," she said quietly, "and now you're continuing his work. That's a beautiful thing, dear." During the drive back to Phoenix, I was quiet, processing what had just happened. I had helped someone in a way that truly mattered, not by creating a clever marketing campaign or increasing brand awareness, but by directly improving someone's quality of life. "How do you feel?" Tom asked as we pulled into my grandfather's driveway. "Terrified," I answered honestly, "and exhilarated, and completely overwhelmed." Sarah, who had come with us for the delivery, smiled. That's exactly how your grandfather felt after his first successful case. The fear never completely goes away, but it keeps you sharp, keeps you focused on getting things right. Back in the workshop, Margaret showed me something I hadn't seen before, a wall covered with thank you letters, photos, and cards from customers whose lives had been changed by my grandfather's work. He read every one of these when he was having doubts, she said. When the corporate pressure got intense, when a device failed and needed to be redesigned, when he wondered whether the work was worth the cost, these letters reminded him why he started and why he kept going. I read some of the messages, each one representing a story of restored independence, renewed hope, or maintained dignity. These weren't just customers. They were lives my grandfather had touched, families he had helped stay together, individuals he had helped remain human in a world that often treated aging as a problem to be managed rather than a stage of life to be supported. But there was also a new addition to the wall, a message that had arrived that very day. It was from Mrs. Anderson's daughter. Thank you for continuing your grandfather's mission. Mom took her first independent steps in months tonight, and she cried with joy. You're not just building devices, you're building hope. As I stood in that workshop, surrounded by the evidence of my grandfather's secret legacy, I realized that my decision had already been made, not consciously, not after careful deliberation, but through action. I had spent the day learning, building, delivering, and helping. I had experienced firsthand what it meant to use technology to serve people rather than profit. Tom must have seen something in my expression because he asked, "So what's the verdict, Jessica? Are you in?" I looked around the workshop one more time, at the tools waiting to be used, at the half-finished projects that could change lives, at the thank you letters that proved the impact of this work. I thought about my marketing job, about the campaigns I'd created to sell products people didn't really need, about the corporate ladder I'd been climbing toward goals that suddenly seemed meaningless. I'm in, I said quietly, but I'm going to need a lot of help. Tom smiled. Your grandfather would be proud. And don't worry, you're not in this alone. We all believe in what he built, and we all want to see it continue. Mrs. Chen nodded. Tomorrow we start your real education. Tonight, we celebrate the fact that Mrs. Anderson is walking independently for the first time in months. As we locked up the workshop and turned off the lights, I realized that my life had just taken a turn I never could have anticipated. 24 hours ago, I'd been a marketing professional with a stable career and predictable future. Now I was the heir to a secret mission that could consume my life, but might also give it meaning I'd never imagined possible. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity. My grandfather had shown me that one person, with enough dedication and creativity, could genuinely change the world for hundreds of people. The question was whether I had the courage to follow in his footsteps. Looking back at the house where so much had been hidden and so much had been accomplished, I knew there was no turning back. I was about to embark on the most challenging and potentially rewarding journey of my life, and I couldn't wait to get started. 3 weeks into my new life as the heir to Rodriguez Solutions, I learned that success can be more dangerous than failure. Word had spread faster than we anticipated. Mrs. Anderson hadn't just used her walker. She'd become our unofficial spokesperson in Tucson's retirement community. Within days, I was fielding calls from Arizona, New Mexico, and California. People were calling about devices they'd heard about through friends, family members who needed help, and problems they hoped we could solve. The waiting list, which had been 6 months long when my grandfather was alive, suddenly doubled. I was working 16-hour days, splitting time between learning technical skills in the workshop and managing an explosion of customer inquiries. Tom had become my full-time mentor, teaching me everything from circuit design to customer psychology. Sarah was helping me develop better phone skills and documentation systems. Margaret was frantically trying to update our business processes to handle the increased volume. But Mrs. Chen delivered the news that changed everything. Jessica, she said, standing in the workshop doorway with an expression I'd never seen before. Pure fear. We have a problem. A big one. She handed me a thick envelope that had arrived by certified mail. The return address made my blood freeze. Medicor Industries, Legal Department. Inside was a cease and desist order, but not like the one they'd sent my grandfather years earlier. This one was backed by a federal investigation notice, claiming that Rodriguez Solutions was operating illegally as an unlicensed medical device manufacturer, engaging in interstate commerce without proper FDA approval, and making fraudulent claims about product effectiveness. The letter gave me 10 days to cease all operations or face federal prosecution. They waited, Tom said grimly as he read over the documents. They waited until your grandfather was gone and you were vulnerable. Now they're making their move. But that wasn't the worst part. Attached to the legal notice was a list of evidence they'd compiled against the operation. Customer testimonials that they claimed were fabricated. Device specifications that they argued were misleading. And most damaging of all, a formal complaint from someone I'd never heard of, claiming that a Rodriguez Solutions device had malfunctioned and caused injury. This is impossible, I said, scanning the complaint details. We don't have any injury reports. Grandpa kept meticulous safety records. Margaret, who had driven up from Phoenix the moment she heard about the legal threat, was already on her laptop researching the complaint. Jessica, this complaint is fake. The customer name, address, even the device model number. None of it exists in our records. They fabricated evidence? It looks that way. But proving it will be expensive and time-consuming. That's exactly what they're counting on. Sarah, who had been quietly reading through additional documents, looked up with worry. There's more. They've filed complaints with the Better Business Bureau, reported us to the Arizona Attorney General's office, and submitted a formal request for FDA investigation. They're not just trying to shut us down, they're trying to destroy our reputation completely. I felt like the walls were closing in. 3 weeks ago, I'd been a marketing professional worrying about campaign budgets and client presentations. Now I was facing federal investigators, corporate lawyers, and the potential destruction of something my grandfather had spent decades building. What would Grandpa have done? I asked, looking around at the faces of people who had supported him through previous battles. Tom was quiet for a long moment. He would have fought. But Jessica, he had years to prepare for this kind of attack. He had established relationships, documented processes, and a deep understanding of the legal landscape. You have 3 weeks of experience. Are you saying I should give up? I'm saying you need to understand what you're up against. Medicor has unlimited resources, experienced lawyers, and political connections. They can drag this out for years, even if we ultimately win. Most small businesses would fold under this kind of pressure. That night, I sat alone in my grandfather's study, surrounded by his journals and technical manuals, trying to figure out how to save something I'd barely begun to understand. The weight of responsibility was crushing. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Mrs. Anderson and her independence, about the people on the waiting list, about the network of collaborators who had believed in this mission. I was reading through my grandfather's notes about previous legal challenges when I found something that changed everything, a hidden folder tucked behind a false back in one of his desk drawers. Inside were documents I'd never seen before, correspondence with journalists who had investigated Medicor's business practices, evidence of other small companies that had been targeted and destroyed, and, most importantly, a detailed dossier my grandfather had compiled about Medicor's own legal vulnerabilities. There were FDA violation reports that Medicor had managed to suppress, internal company emails discussing strategies to eliminate competition through legal intimidation, evidence of price-fixing schemes that had kept medical devices artificially expensive for years. My grandfather hadn't just defended against Medicor's attacks. He'd been gathering ammunition for a counterattack. But the most shocking discovery was a letter dated just 2 months before his death, addressed to me but marked, "Open only if Rodriguez Solutions is threatened with shutdown." Jessie-girl, if you're reading this, it means they've made their move, and you've decided to fight for what we built together. I'm proud of you for that choice, but I need you to understand what you're really fighting for. This isn't just about helping people with disabilities or seniors who need assistance. This is about whether technology will serve humanity or exploit it. Medicor and companies like them have built their entire business model on keeping life-saving technology expensive and inaccessible. They profit from human suffering. But here's what they don't know. We're not alone. Over the years, I've been quietly connecting with other inventors, small manufacturers, and advocates who share our mission. There's a whole network of people fighting the same battle from different angles. The documents in this folder will give you the tools to fight back, but more importantly, they'll connect you with allies who can help you win. Don't just defend Rodriguez Solutions, Jessie. Use this opportunity to expose what they've been doing and build something bigger than what I ever imagined. Remember, you're not just my granddaughter, you're a force for change in a world that desperately needs it. All my love and faith in your future, Grandpa. Attached to the letter was a list of contacts, journalists, lawyers, other inventors, advocacy groups, along with detailed instructions for how to coordinate a response that would turn Medicor's attack into their own public relations nightmare. The next morning, I called an emergency meeting with the team. When they arrived at the workshop, I had the war room set up, whiteboards covered with strategy notes, boxes of evidence organized by category, and a plan that would either save Rodriguez Solutions or destroy my life trying. We're not just going to defend against this attack, I announced. We're going to use it as an opportunity to expose what Medicor has been doing to small innovators for years. Margaret looked skeptical. Jessica, that's incredibly risky. If we go on the offensive and lose, we'll face even worse consequences. And if we just defend, we'll spend years in legal battles while people who need our help go without it, I replied. My grandfather didn't build this operation to play it safe. He built it to make a difference. Tom studied the documents I'd found. This evidence is solid, but using it effectively will require perfect coordination and timing. One mistake, and Medicor's lawyers will bury us. Then we don't make mistakes. Over the next week, we executed the most complex plan I'd ever been involved with. Sarah reached out to the network of contacts my grandfather had cultivated, building a coalition of inventors and advocates who had been targeted by similar corporate bullying. Margaret worked with a team of volunteer lawyers who specialized in defending small businesses against frivolous lawsuits. Mrs. Chen coordinated with investigative journalists who had been looking for evidence of Medicor's anti-competitive practices. I focused on what I knew best, crafting a message that would resonate with the public and shift the narrative from illegal device manufacturer to, quote, compassionate innovator under attack by corporate greed. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source: our customers. When word spread through the senior community network that Rodriguez Solutions was under attack, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Letters of support poured in from people whose lives had been changed by my grandfather's work. Local news stations received calls from families wanting to share their stories. Social media posts began appearing with photos of people using Rodriguez Solutions devices and testimonials about regained independence. Mrs. Anderson, despite being 82 and not particularly tech-savvy, somehow organized a letter-writing campaign that resulted in over 500 handwritten letters being sent to the FDA, the Arizona Attorney General, and Medicor's headquarters within 3 days. Jessica, Sarah said, walking into the workshop with a newspaper, you need to see this. The Arizona Republic had run a front-page story, Local Inventor's Legacy Under Attack, Senior Community Rallies to Defend Life-Changing Technology Company. The article featured interviews with a dozen Rodriguez Solutions customers, detailed explanations of how our devices worked, and pointed questions about why a major corporation was trying to shut down a small operation that was clearly helping people. But the most powerful part was a quote from Mrs. Anderson. They're not just attacking a business. They're attacking our independence, our dignity, and our right to age in our own homes with technology that actually works. Within 48 hours, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. David versus Goliath, Senior Citizens Fight Corporate Giant to Save Medical Device Company, became a trending topic on social media. Suddenly, Medicor found themselves in the position of explaining why they were trying to shut down a beloved local company that was helping elderly people maintain their independence. The tide was turning, but I knew the real battle was just beginning. That evening, as I was reviewing legal documents and preparing for what would likely be months of litigation, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer. Is this Jessica Martinez? The voice was professional but warm. Yes, who is this? My name is Rebecca Sullivan. I'm a senior investigator with the FDA, and I've been following the Rodriguez Solutions case. I wonder if we could arrange a meeting. I think there are some things you should know about the complaints that have been filed against your company. My heart pounded. An FDA investigator wanting to meet could mean anything, validation or destruction. What kind of things? I asked carefully. The kind that might interest you to know that you're not the first small medical device company Medicor has targeted this year. And based on what I've discovered, you probably won't be the last unless someone takes a stand. I looked around the workshop, at the devices waiting to help people, at the thank you letters covering the walls, at the legacy my grandfather had built and trusted me to protect. When and where do you want to meet? I asked. The war was far from over, but for the first time since receiving that legal threat, I felt like we might actually have a chance to win. The meeting with Rebecca Sullivan took place in a small cafe in downtown Phoenix, far from the workshop and away from any potential surveillance. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and the kind of confident demeanor that suggested she was very good at her job. Before we start, she said, sliding a business card across the table, I want you to know that I'm here unofficially. What I'm about to share with you could end my career if it gets back to certain people at the FDA. I studied her card. Rebecca Sullivan, Senior Compliance Investigator, FDA Medical Device Division. Why are you taking that risk? Because I've spent the last 5 years watching companies like Medicor manipulate the regulatory system to destroy legitimate small businesses, and I'm sick of it. She opened a thick folder and pulled out documents I recognized, the fake complaint that had been filed against Rodriguez Solutions. This complaint is completely fabricated, she said bluntly. The patient doesn't exist, the device model was never manufactured, and the injury described is medically impossible given the specifications of your grandfather's designs. So you can dismiss it? Rebecca shook her head. It's not that simple. Medicor has lawyers who know exactly how to work the system. They filed just enough documentation to trigger a formal investigation, which requires us to treat their complaints as legitimate until proven otherwise. The process can take years, and most small companies fold before it's resolved. She pulled out another file, this one much thicker. But here's what they don't know. I've been building a case against their pattern of abuse for the past 2 years. Your situation is the missing piece I needed. The documents she showed me were staggering. Over the past decade, Medicor had filed similar complaints against 17 other small medical device companies. In every case, the complaints were either fabricated or grossly exaggerated. In every case, the small companies had been forced out of business before the investigations were completed. They've perfected the process, Rebecca explained. File false complaints, trigger federal investigations, leak information to industry publications suggesting regulatory problems, then swoop in to acquire the company's assets or customer base at bargain prices. I felt sick. How is this legal? Technically, it isn't. But proving a pattern of fraudulent complaints requires evidence that's been very difficult to gather. Until now. She pulled out a recording device and placed it on the table between us. Yesterday, I received a call from a Medicor executive named David Chen. No relation to your Mrs. Chen, I assume. He wanted to discuss, quote, expediting the Rodriguez Solutions investigation for the good of public safety. Rebecca pressed play. The voice that came through the speaker was smooth and professional, but the words were chilling. Ms. Sullivan, I'm sure you understand that small operations like Rodriguez Solutions pose significant risks to public safety. They lack the resources for proper quality control, the expertise for regulatory compliance, and the infrastructure for reliable customer support. The sooner we can resolve this matter, the sooner we can ensure patients have access to properly manufactured, FDA-approved devices. Rebecca's voice responded, Mr. Chen, are you suggesting that we should prioritize this investigation based on the size of the company rather than the merit of the complaints? Of course not. I'm simply pointing out that Medicor has the capacity to serve these customers properly. We've been developing similar products for years, and we'd be happy to discuss acquisition of Rodriguez Solutions' customer database to ensure continuity of care. You want to buy their customer list? For the good of the patients, naturally. We could have our products available to Rodriguez customers within 60 days of their closure. My hands were shaking as I listened to a Medicor executive casually discussing the acquisition of our customer base before the investigation had even begun. They weren't just trying to shut us down. They were planning to profit from our destruction. "This is evidence of intent," Rebecca said, stopping the recording. "Combined with the pattern of false complaints, this gives us grounds for a federal investigation into Medicor's business practices rather than yours." But she warned me that the fight ahead would be brutal. Medicor has resources, political connections, and experience destroying companies that threaten their market position. If we're going to take them on, we need to be absolutely perfect in our execution. Over the next hour, Rebecca outlined a strategy that would require coordination between multiple federal agencies, careful timing of media releases, and flawless documentation of every aspect of Rodriguez Solutions' operations. "The good news is that your grandfather was meticulous about compliance," she said, reviewing files I'd brought from the workshop. "Every device properly documented, every safety protocol followed, every customer interaction recorded. Medicor picked the wrong target this time." But the most important part of Rebecca's plan involved something I hadn't expected: going public with the entire story. "We need to file a formal complaint against Medicor for fraudulent regulatory manipulation," she explained. "But to make it stick, we need public pressure and media attention to prevent them from burying the case in bureaucratic delays." That evening, I returned to the workshop to find the team waiting for me with news of their own. Tom had been contacted by inventors from 3 other states, all small medical device manufacturers who had been targeted by Medicor using similar tactics. "It's bigger than we thought," Tom said, showing me emails from colleagues in Oregon, Michigan, and North Carolina. Medicor has been systematically eliminating small competitors across the entire industry. Sarah had been coordinating with the journalists who were following our story. "They want to do a comprehensive investigation into Medicor's practices, but they need more sources willing to go on record. The other inventors Tom contacted might be the key." Margaret had been analyzing the financial impact of Medicor's strategy. If they successfully eliminate all small manufacturers, they'll control enough of the market to raise prices without competition. We're talking about devices that help millions of people becoming unaffordable for anyone without premium insurance. Mrs. Chen, who had been quietly working at her computer, looked up with determination. "Jessica, I've been thinking about what your grandfather would want us to do. He wouldn't just want us to save Rodriguez Solutions. He'd want us to make sure this never happens to anyone else." She was right. This wasn't just about protecting one company anymore. It was about protecting the entire ecosystem of small innovators who were developing solutions for people that big corporations ignored. "What are you proposing?" I asked. "We go nuclear," she said simply. "We don't just defend against their attack. We expose their entire operation and help every company they've targeted fight back simultaneously." The plan that emerged over the next few days was ambitious beyond anything I could have imagined when I first discovered my grandfather's workshop. Working with Rebecca's guidance, we would coordinate a multi-state effort to expose Medicor's fraudulent practices while simultaneously demonstrating the positive impact of small medical device manufacturers. Tom reached out to the other targeted inventors, building a coalition of companies willing to share their experiences and evidence. Sarah coordinated with investigative journalists from major news outlets, providing them with documentation and access to affected customers. Margaret worked with volunteer lawyers to prepare legal challenges in multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. But my role was the most challenging. I had to become the public face of the movement while continuing to run Rodriguez Solutions and learn the technical skills necessary to maintain our operations. The breakthrough came when Mrs. Anderson volunteered to testify at a congressional hearing about medical device accessibility. Her story, an 82-year-old woman who had regained her independence through technology built by a retired construction worker in his basement, perfectly illustrated everything we were fighting for. "I don't understand all the legal complexities," she told the subcommittee, "but I understand that my walker works better than anything I could buy from a major manufacturer, costs half as much, and was built by someone who cared more about my independence than his profit margin. If that's illegal, then we have a problem with our laws, not with our innovators." Her testimony, broadcast on C-SPAN and shared millions of times on social media, shifted the entire narrative. Suddenly, the story wasn't about regulatory compliance or business competition. It was about whether technology would serve people or profits. Medicore's response was swift and predictable. They launched a public relations campaign emphasizing safety concerns, regulatory compliance, and the risks of unregulated medical devices. They produced expert witnesses who questioned the reliability of small-scale manufacturing and suggested that companies like Rodriguez Solutions were putting patients at risk to save money. But they made a critical mistake. They underestimated the power of customer testimonials and the public's growing distrust of large corporations that seemed more interested in profits than people. Within a week, social media was flooded with stories from Rodriguez Solutions customers, along with similar testimonials from customers of the other small companies Medicore had targeted. The hashtag #Tech4People began trending, with thousands of people sharing stories about how small innovators had solved problems that big companies had ignored. The turning point came when a Medicore executive made a disastrous appearance on a national news program. When asked why the company was trying to shut down businesses that were clearly helping people, he responded, "Innovation requires proper resources, regulatory expertise, and scalable manufacturing. These garage operations simply cannot provide the consistency and reliability that patients deserve." The interviewer immediately followed up, "Are you saying that Mrs. Anderson, who we just heard from, doesn't deserve the independence she's gained from her, quote, garage operation walker?" "Well, no, but..." "And the veteran from Oregon who regained mobility through a device your company said was impossible to manufacture profitably, he doesn't matter?" The executive's attempts to backtrack only made things worse, and the interview became a viral sensation that perfectly captured the arrogance and disconnection of corporate executives who had never spoken directly with the people their decisions affected. But I knew that viral videos and public sympathy wouldn't be enough to win a legal battle against a company with unlimited resources. We needed concrete victories, documented evidence of wrongdoing, and regulatory changes that would prevent future attacks. That's when Rebecca called with news that changed everything. "Jessica, we have a problem, but it might actually be an opportunity. Medicore has filed a federal lawsuit against you personally, claiming defamation and interference with business operations. They're seeking damages of $50 million. My heart stopped. $50 million? For what? For the public statements you've made about their business practices. But here's the interesting part. By filing this lawsuit, they've opened themselves up to discovery proceedings that will give us legal access to their internal communications, financial records, and strategic planning documents. Meaning we're about to get evidence that will either destroy us completely or give us everything we need to bring down their entire fraudulent operation." I sat in my grandfather's chair, looking around the workshop where so much had been built and so much was now at risk. $50 million in damages would destroy not just Rodriguez Solutions but my entire life. But it would also give us the chance to expose the truth about what Medicore had been doing to small innovators across the country. "Rebecca," I said finally, "what do I need to do to make sure we get that evidence?" The discovery process began 6 weeks after Medicore filed their lawsuit against me. What we found in their internal documents was worse than any of us had imagined. Rebecca and our legal team had gained access to 5 years of Medicore's internal communications, strategic planning documents, and financial records. What emerged was a detailed blueprint for systematically eliminating small medical device manufacturers across the United States. They called it Project Consolidation. The documents revealed that Medicore had identified over 40 small companies that were developing innovative solutions in markets they wanted to control. For each company, they had developed detailed profiles, business models, key personnel, customer bases, and specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Rodriguez Solutions was just one name on a very long list. "Look at this," Margaret said, pointing to a spreadsheet that made my blood boil. It showed projected revenue increases for Medicore following the elimination of each targeted company. My grandfather's operation was valued at $2.3 million in potential annual revenue that would flow to Medicore once we were destroyed. They had calculated the profit value of our customers' suffering. But the most damaging evidence came from internal emails between Medicore executives discussing their strategy. One email from their CEO, Richard Morrison, was particularly revealing. The Rodriguez situation demonstrates why we must accelerate project consolidation. Small operators like William Rodriguez are creating customer expectations for personalized service and affordable pricing that our business model cannot sustain. If seniors begin to expect $500 mobility devices that actually work for their specific needs, we cannot continue charging $3,000 for mass-produced units that provide generic solutions. Another email from their legal department was even more explicit. Fraudulent complaints remain our most effective tool for triggering federal investigations that small companies cannot afford to fight. The key is creating enough documentation to appear legitimate, while ensuring the complaints cannot be easily disproven during the time it takes for small operators to exhaust their resources. They had literally developed a manual for destroying small businesses through regulatory manipulation. But the discovery process worked both ways. Medicor's lawyers had demanded access to all Rodriguez Solutions records, customer communications, and financial data. What they found, much to their apparent surprise, was a company that exceeded regulatory compliance standards in every measurable way. My grandfather's meticulous documentation became our strongest defense. Every device had been tested beyond FDA requirements. Every customer interaction had been properly recorded. Every safety protocol had been followed with scientific precision. More importantly, our customer satisfaction rates were extraordinary. Over 98% of Rodriguez Solutions customers reported significant improvement in their quality of life. Return rates were virtually zero. Injury reports were non-existent. Medicor's own products, according to internal documents we'd obtained, had return rates of 23%. And customer satisfaction scores that their executives described as adequate for the market segment. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. 3 months into the legal battle, Rebecca called with news that would change everything. Jessica, the Department of Justice has opened a formal investigation into Medicor's business practices. They want to interview you as a key witness in what could become the largest corporate fraud case in the medical device industry. The DOJ investigation revealed that project consolidation was just one part of a larger scheme. Medicor had been systematically overcharging Medicare and Medicaid for medical devices, using regulatory manipulation to eliminate competitors who offered better products at lower prices, and engaging in price-fixing agreements with other major manufacturers. The financial scope was staggering. Over $400 million in fraudulent billings to government healthcare programs over 5 years. But for me, the most important victory was much more personal. Mrs. Anderson called me on a Tuesday morning in April, almost 6 months after our legal battle had begun. "Jessica, dear, I wanted you to know that I walked 3 miles yesterday. 3 miles! At my age, with my conditions, using the walker your grandfather designed and you delivered. That's not just mobility, that's freedom." She paused, and I could hear tears in her voice. "I also wanted you to know that I'm not the only one. There are over 200 people in our senior community alone who are using devices from Rodriguez Solutions or the other small companies you've been defending. You're not just fighting for a business, sweetheart. You're fighting for our independence." That conversation reminded me why this battle mattered more than any legal victory or financial settlement. The final hearing took place on a rainy Thursday in October, exactly 1 year after I'd first discovered my grandfather's workshop. The courtroom was packed with Rodriguez Solutions customers, other small business owners, journalists, and advocates who had joined our cause. Medicor's legal team made their final argument, claiming that they were protecting public safety by ensuring medical devices were manufactured by companies with, quote, appropriate resources and expertise. They portrayed small manufacturers as dangerous amateurs who put patients at risk to save money. But when it was our turn to present, the evidence spoke for itself. Rebecca testified about the pattern of fraudulent complaints. The other targeted inventors shared their stories of harassment and intimidation. Customer after customer testified about how small manufacturers had provided solutions that big companies had ignored or priced beyond reach. The judge's ruling was comprehensive and devastating for Medicor. Not only did he dismiss their lawsuit against me, but he issued a permanent injunction, preventing them from filing fraudulent regulatory complaints against small medical device manufacturers. He ordered them to pay $15 million in damages to the companies they had targeted, and he referred the case to federal prosecutors for criminal investigation. But the most satisfying moment came when he addressed Medicore's lawyers directly. This case represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what innovation looks like in America. The defendants have attempted to criminalize the very entrepreneurial spirit that drives technological advancement. Rodriguez Solutions and companies like it represent the best of American innovation, individuals who identify problems and develop solutions because they care about helping people, not because they see an opportunity for profit maximization. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by customers, colleagues, and journalists, I realized that my grandfather's secret had become something he never could have imagined, a movement that was changing how we think about technology, innovation, and corporate responsibility. But the real victory wasn't the legal judgment or the media attention, it was what happened next. Over the following months, 3 major changes transformed the medical device industry. First, Congress passed the Small Manufacturer Protection Act, making it illegal for large corporations to file fraudulent regulatory complaints against smaller competitors. The legislation included funding for a fast-track review process that would help legitimate small manufacturers navigate regulatory requirements without being destroyed by legal costs. Second, several major universities established programs specifically designed to support small medical device innovators, providing both technical resources and legal protection for inventors developing solutions for underserved populations. Third, and most importantly, a network of small manufacturers emerged that began collaborating instead of competing, sharing resources, expertise, and customer service capabilities, while maintaining their individual focuses on specific problems and populations. Rodriguez Solutions became the model for this new approach. We grew, but deliberately and carefully. Instead of trying to serve everyone, we focused on developing the most advanced assistive technology for people whose needs were too complex or specific for mass-market solutions. Tom became our head of engineering, leading a team that now included 2 former Medicore employees who had been disgusted by their company's practices. Sarah expanded our customer service operation, developing protocols that other small manufacturers adopted for their own operations. Margaret established a consulting practice that helped small manufacturers navigate regulatory requirements and protect themselves from corporate intimidation. Mrs. Chen took on a role I hadn't expected. She became our head of strategic partnerships, building relationships with other small manufacturers, advocacy groups, and healthcare organizations that shared our mission. And me? I became something I'd never planned to be. The CEO of a company that measured success not just in revenue or growth, but in lives improved and independence restored. 5 years after discovering my grandfather's workshop, Rodriguez Solutions had grown to serve customers in all 50 states. We employed 12 people full-time and worked with a network of contractors and partners who shared our commitment to personalized, affordable assistive technology. But we never lost sight of what made us different. Every device was still custom-built for individual needs. Every customer was still treated like family. Every decision was still made with the question, how will this help people live with greater independence and dignity? The workshop in my grandfather's basement became our research and development center, but we built a proper manufacturing facility in a converted warehouse across town. The walls of our new building are covered with thank you letters, photos of customers using our devices, and stories of lives changed by technology that puts people before profits. Mrs. Anderson, now 87, serves on our advisory board. She still uses the walker my grandfather designed, though we've upgraded it twice with new features she requested. Last month, she walked her great-great-granddaughter down the aisle at her wedding. The house on Maple Street remains in the family. I live there now, in the same rooms where my grandfather quietly changed the world while letting everyone think he was just a retired construction worker who kept to himself. In his study, I keep his journals, his tools, and the pocket watch he left me. But I also keep something new: letters from other inventors, other families, other people who have found the courage to build solutions for problems that big companies ignore. Because I learned something important from my grandfather's secret. The most powerful innovations don't come from corporate research departments or venture capital funding. They come from people who see suffering and decide to do something about it, one device at a time, one customer at a time, one life at a time. Medicor eventually settled the federal fraud case for $2.8 billion, the largest fine in medical device industry history. Richard Morrison resigned in disgrace. The company was broken up and sold to competitors who agreed to maintain competitive pricing and support for small manufacturers. But the real victory wasn't their downfall, it was what rose from the ashes of their monopolistic practices. An entire ecosystem of small manufacturers, each focused on solving specific problems for specific populations, each committed to the principle that technology should serve humanity rather than exploit it. My grandfather never lived to see the movement his secret workshop inspired. But every day, in workshops and laboratories and basement facilities across the country, inventors are building solutions that big companies said were impossible or unprofitable. They're building them anyway, because that's what love looks like when it's applied to technology. That's what my grandfather taught me, even though he never said it directly. The most important innovations happen when we stop asking how can we make money, and start asking how can we help. Today, Rodriguez Solutions helps over 5,000 people live independently in their own homes. We've inspired dozens of other small manufacturers and helped pass legislation that protects innovators from corporate intimidation. But the number I'm most proud of is this one: 0. That's the number of customers we've lost to preventable injuries, safety failures, or device malfunctions. Because when you build technology with love instead of greed, when you prioritize people over profits, when you measure success in lives improved rather than revenue generated, everything changes. My grandfather's secret wasn't just a business hidden in a basement. It was a blueprint for how technology can serve humanity when it's built by people who actually care about the humans they're serving. And that secret is hidden no more. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.